All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to completely shatter a really common textbook illusion about the history of human thought, the origins of Western logic.
You know, when we look back at the grand timeline of philosophy, it is so incredibly easy to think that monumental ideas just popped into existence overnight. I mean, if you open almost any standard philosophy textbook, you'll likely see this exact phrase staring back at you. Aristotle invented logic. It's stated as just this simple historical fact, almost as if Aristotle woke up one morning, grabbed some parchment, and thought, hey, I think I'll write the definitive rule book for human reasoning today, entirely from scratch.
But did he really just invent it out of thin air? Well, to answer that, we've got to travel a bit further back in time. We're going to treat the early Greek philosophers almost like detectives, or maybe suspects, who left this scattered trail of clues behind them. And as we'll see, these clues slowly built up into a massive, sprawling intellectual puzzle, a puzzle that Aristotle ultimately had to solve, rather than create.
So the really crucial takeaway here is that while Aristotle undeniably gave us the systematic framework of logic, the organized science of deduction, proof, and the syllogism, the raw underlying questions were brewing long before he was even born. He didn't invent logical thinking itself. What he actually did was take these pre-existing, deeply rooted metaphysical debates and transform them into a rigid, structured discipline.
Believe it or not, the very first seeds of logic didn't actually start out as logic at all. Nope, they started as a profound metaphysical puzzle about how we make sense of a really chaotic world. The core question that just plagued the ancients was this: how do we actually unite different things into a single thought? How on earth does this human mind process a universe that is just full of endless, unpredictable variety?
Early Greek thinkers were absolutely obsessed with this. They called it the one versus many problem. They were asking, how can there be unity in multiplicity? How is stability even possible when everything is constantly changing? How can one universal element exist across a bunch of specific objects? They were desperately trying to figure out how our brains take a chaotic jumble of disconnected, everyday experiences and somehow fuse them together into a single cohesive reality.
And this perfectly illustrates the early intellectual clash that really set the stage for logic. In one corner, you had Heraclitus. He argued that everything is just a relentless, chaotic process of becoming, always changing. But in the other corner, you had the Eleatic tradition, insisting that true reality is entirely static and singular. So we had this massive philosophical gridlock, pure chaotic change on one side versus pure frozen stability on the other.
Then something fascinating happened. We get a major pivot, the Sophist shift. Thinkers like Pythagorean and Gorgias arrived on the scene and just completely flipped the script. Instead of looking out there and trying to figure out the external universe, like the stars and the elements, they turned the lens inward. They started meticulously analyzing human knowledge, and specifically human language.
By turning that focus inward, the Sophists essentially dragged that abstract one versus many problem right down into the messy, everyday realm of human communication. And they asked a really dangerous, pressing question. If human thought, human language, and the actual physical reality of the universe don't perfectly align, then how do we actually determine what is true? It was this subjective, skeptical approach that brought humanity incredibly close to realizing we needed actual, formal logic.
Which brings us to something called the predication problem. Let's look at a super simple, everyday statement. Socrates is wise. We say things exactly like this all the time without even blinking. But to these early philosophers, this seemingly innocent sentence hid a massive philosophical headache.
When we break this sentence down, we are actually looking at two entirely distinct elements. As the subject, we have Socrates, a very specific, physical, individual person. But as the predicate, we have is wise, an abstract, intangible quality. We are dealing with two completely different categories of reality here. So the burning question became, how do these two completely different elements combine to form a single coherent judgment? How does human thought manage to stitch a flesh and blood person and a floating, abstract concept together to form one unified, logical proposition? This right here is the core engine of what logic would eventually need to explain.
Enter Socrates, the absolute master of the concept. Socrates steps right into the middle of this intense intellectual debate and offers a totally groundbreaking method to build understanding out of all this chaos. He realized that we desperately needed a reliable, systematic way to map the specific onto the universal.
He championed a brilliant step-by-step process. First, we observe particular examples, say looking at individual acts of fairness in a city. Then, we compare them. We generalize to see what they actually share. We use abstraction to strip away all the irrelevant differences. And finally, we construct the general, universal concept, like justice. It's basically an intellectual assembly line.
Now, while Socrates didn't quite have a complete, mathematically precise system of deductions and syllogisms just yet, his invention of these two tools, induction, which is moving from specific examples to a general conclusion, and definition, clearly expressing those common elements, well, they laid the absolute bedrock for logical science. He gave us the primary building blocks.
But hey, it wasn't a smooth ride to the finish line. I mean, intellectual progress rarely is, right? Philosophers like Antisthenes pushed back really hard with a theory of extreme nominalism. He essentially argued that reality consists solely of isolated objects, and they can only be known by their specific names. In his view, you can't just casually mix and match names and abstract qualities however you please. Antisthenes pointed out a glaring paradox that threatened to derail everything. If every object is just its own unique, completely isolated thing, then how can we ever logically assert that A is B? If reality is strictly separate items, then saying Socrates is wise is technically an impossible contradiction. Socrates is Socrates, wise is wise. You simply can't bridge that gap. And this perfectly shows that the central crisis leading up to Aristotle was entirely about connection. The ultimate puzzle was, how does thought safely and accurately weave separate objects and qualities together into a truth-telling machine? How do we build a unified argument out of fragmented pieces of reality? Because without this loom, reliable proof was completely impossible. When we step back and map out this historical relay race, the bigger picture becomes crystal clear. It's undeniable that the baton of this specific problem was passed from generation to generation over centuries. We go from the early Greeks grappling with the one versus many, right through the Sophists, over to Socrates and Plato, all the way straight to Aristotle's doorstep.
Which brings us right back to our starting point. Aristotle didn't invent the act of arguing, and he definitely didn't invent the fundamental questions of truth and unity. His true genius was being the ultimate intellectual architect. He took all these scattered clues, all these intense pre-existing debates, and brilliantly synthesized them into a unified systematic science of deduction and proof. He essentially built the definitive house of logic to contain them all.
But as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought, one that really expands this entire narrative. If complex, systematic methods of proof and inference, like those found in the Yaya, Buddhist, and Jain systems, evolved completely independently in ancient India, well, is the birth of logic purely a Western story? Or does this parallel development reveal something profoundly universal about the way the human mind just strives to understand the world? It's a fascinating question and definitely something for us to chew on.